Okay. This was number two. Number two. Significance of GDP. We want to know why GDP is the biggest and the baddest statistic for economists. Okay? So I got three things that we're going to use GDP for. The first is GDP allows us to see changes in productivity in our economy. So we'll say allows us to, we'll say, measure changes in productivity. So the statistic is a dollar value, right? It's a dollar value of all things that are being produced in our economy. And so when GDP increases or decreases, that allows us to see how productive we are being. And really, you go back to Unit 1. Unit 1, we talked about production possibilities. Okay? You think of your production possibility graph as a graph that illustrates, the potential that an economy has with its resources. The GDP, you could put a dollar value on what's your potential GDP, right? And this allows us to measure or see, all right, where's our potential? How much should we be producing? And what are we actually producing? And we will use GDP in that way a lot to see, where should we be and where are we at? And we can do all of that in dollars, okay? Which I think is a pretty important thing. Second thing that's significant about GDP is it allows us to see changes in unemployment. So it allows us to see changes in, and I'm going to abbreviate here, UE stands for unemployment. Okay? So here's the idea, and then we'll use this through the whole semester. For an example here, when we are being productive and our GDP is increasing, okay, then that's a pretty good indicator that we're producing more stuff and we're probably employing more workers while we're producing more stuff. Or vice versa, when our GDP is falling, decrease in GDP means that we're being less productive and we're probably using less workers. So our unemployment rate usually is increasing. So that's a pattern that we see often. A fall in GDP, usually we can assume that there's going to be a rise in unemployment that's going with that. Okay? We can measure productivity. We can see changes in unemployment when our GDP changes. And then the last is, we'll say, allows us to see changes in income. See changes in income. So GDP and unemployment are inversely related. Okay? GDP and income are going to go together. So when GDP is increasing, that means we're producing more stuff, we're being more productive, and we can assume then that more production means people are making more money in the economy. Okay? So that's an important thing for us to know. As GDP goes up, income levels are going to go up. People have more money, and that's going to keep our economy growing. Okay? So those are three things, or three assumptions maybe, that we're going to want to hold on to and make sure that we remember and understand as we talk about GDP. Because a lot of what we will do in here will be, scenario X or Y is causing GDP to change. And remember, when GDP changes, these things are also going to be assumed. Okay? So that will help us keep those things straight. All right, moving on. Number 3, we're going to talk about calculating GDP. 3 here. Calculating GDP. And there are two methods that we use to calculate GDP. But two methods. One of the methods is one that we're going to use in here for the whole semester. The other method is one that is good to know, but we don't really use it much in this class. So we'll talk about it today just so we know that there's multiple methods, but after that, kind of leave it in the dust and we move on. And the only reason why we only focus on one method is because the AP exam only really tests us on one method of calculating GDP. We just focus on that one method, okay? So the first method, the one that's most important to us, we call the expenditure method. The expenditure method. And the second method we refer to as the income method. So the expenditure method is just the method that we use to calculate GDP by adding up all dollars that are spent in the economy. Okay? So we'll just say the expenditure method, we add together all dollars spent. When we do that, that's going to give us the GDP using the expenditure method. Now, it's important that we know that we're talking about all dollars that are spent on final goods that are produced inside the United States within a specific amount of time. Okay? So we add up the spending on goods that fall into that what's counted category, and that's going to give us GDP using our expenditure method. The income method is just the same thing, but we're adding together all dollars that are earned in the economy. So we'll put here add together all dollars earned. So we are most concerned about the expenditure method, and we're going to spend some time talking about that. But I do think it's important for us to know why both of these methods can be used. Okay? And so we're going to add just a little note down here on the bottom. Okay? And we're going to say that all dollars spent in an economy turn into someone's income. Okay? So let's say all dollars spent turn into someone's income. And that's why these two methods will eventually equal each other. We can add up all the dollars that are spent, or we can add up all the money that people are earning in the economy, okay? And essentially, because of this, all dollars that get spent turned into someone's income, they should be the same, okay? And so that's important for us to know why we have multiple methods. And that's also why we count all forms of income in our GDP. Okay, if you're ever asked what's counted, if somebody made money off of something, okay, then a good or a service must have been provided, and so we're going to count that transaction in our GDP. Okay, so that's important for us to know. All right, does everybody have this down? All right, moving forward. And let's talk specifically about the expenditure method. Expenditure method. So we get this expenditure method by adding together what we're going to refer to as the four components of GDP. Okay? And those four components are C plus I plus G plus net exports, or NX, sorry. C plus I plus G plus NX. So those are our four components. That's how we kind of refer to those four components. And so we need to know that all four of those added together give us our GDP. So any change in any of those components will result in a change in our GDP statistic. So we need to break down those four components. Okay? So let's put here 4 GDP components. And let's talk about what those 4 things represent, those 4 letters. Okay? And we'll start with the C component. It's too small. A little bigger here. So the C component represents what we call consumer spending. Okay? And really, all consumer spending is it's the spending that is done by individual households. Okay, so we'll put individual household spending. And this is the largest component of the 4. Okay, 70% of our GDP comes from individual household spending. So that would be spending on, and we can add a couple examples here. That would be spending on things like food, clothing, education, transportation would be another one. We could go on and on. All the things that you and I spend our money on are going to fall into that component of GDP. Okay? About 70% of the GDP comes from our spending. If you think about that, the GDP was $18 trillion. 70% of $18 trillion, that's a big number. That's a lot of money that gets spent on this stuff. Okay? Okay. And so we call that that's the C component. Okay? The second component is the I. This one seems to be the one that students get the most confused with. Okay? The I really stands for business investment spending. Put that down here. Business investment spending. Okay? Now this is where the confusion, I think, comes from. When students see the term investment, okay, for a good reason, we often think about money that people are putting in places for the future. So buying, putting money in the stock market, or putting your money into a bank account, or putting your money anywhere that you could put it and then take it out later and spend it. Okay? For us, that action is financial investment. Okay? When we see investment or business investment, we are not talking about that. We are talking about business spending on capital goods. Okay, so let's add that to here. Business spending, and we'll put spending on capital. We have to go back to Unit 1 to remember what capital was, right? The factors of production. We had land, labor, capital. That's the capital that we're talking about. And that was our man-made resources, things like factories, things like equipment, machinery, technology. All of those things fall in that capital category. And all of those things would be counted in this I component. So let's just put a couple examples underneath here. Put example. And we're going to say technology, machinery, and we'll add equipment. Now there's 2 curveballs that we have to add, that we have to know. Okay? That these are things that fall in this category that are a little bit unexpected because they're not really capital. Okay? The first is business inventory. So we'll put down business inventory. Now, business inventory is just fancy for the stuff that a business has on its shelves or in some sort of a warehouse that they're waiting to sell. Okay? So remember, GDP measures all things that are produced. Okay? When we use this expenditure method, we are counting all things that are purchased. Well, there's some discrepancy there, right? There's things that are produced that aren't purchased that still need to be counted in the GDP. This is our way of doing that. So everything is counted when it is produced, okay? If it's not sold yet, it's going to fall into business inventory. You walk into Meijer, and the inventory that Meijer has, right, on their shelves is crazy, right? Think of all the bags of Doritos they have just in that one Granville store. Holy smokes. Those all need to be counted in the GDP, right? So before they are purchased, they're going to fall into the business inventory component, okay, or this business spending component. Now, as soon as you or I go and buy those Doritos, now all that happens is the transaction is going to change positions. The actual GDP isn't going to change in that scenario. Okay, it's counted already, but it's going to go from the I component to the C component. Okay, so this is our way of counting everything that is produced even before it is purchased. Question? That's true. You could see that the markup from where they originally bought it to what they're selling at, that could change the GDP. But in terms of quantity of stuff, it's not going to change. Okay. All right. Last curveball is new home sales. I'm going to throw mine underneath here. So I like to think of new home sales as the only thing that you and I can spend our money on that would not be counted in the C component and would fall into the I component of GDP. Okay? New home sales, the only thing that we can spend our money on that falls in this I component. And because it's a curveball, it seems to show up on the AP exam a decent amount of times. I don't know why. They're just attempting to keep us on our toes, we'll say. Okay? So just know we got to be ready for that. Okay? All right, so that's the I component of GDP. Now the next two I think are pretty straightforward. The third one is the G component, and that stands for government spending. And we don't care what the government's spending their money on. As long as they're buying stuff, it's counted in the G component. They can buy food. They can buy clothes. If it's the government, it goes in the G component. Okay? Typically for our class, we're going to see examples of the government spending money on, new roads and highways, on military, or on, maybe science and research, or specific government programs. It doesn't really matter what they're spending money on. It all falls into the G component, and it all influences GDP. Question? Yes, government employees would fall into that as well. Yep, because that's government spending on government programs. Okay, the only government spending that's not going to fall into this category is going to be transfer payments, and those are just payments where nothing's being purchased or produced. We're giving money to people because they fall into some sort of a requirement or entitlement program, like Social Security, welfare would be another example. There's nothing produced there, just an exchange of money. Okay, that's the only government transaction that's not going to be counted. All right, and then the last is the NX category or component, and that stands for net exports. And net exports really is just exports minus imports. So this is our way to clear up our statistic and make sure that we're counting all things that other countries buy, but anything that we buy from other countries has to be subtracted. Okay, those are imports. Those are not going to be counted. And so this is our place to adjust our GDP and subtract anything that that is bought from another country. And if you know anything about exports and imports in the United States, typically for us, we buy more imports than other countries buy our exports. And so that component for us is going to be a negative number most often. Okay? Because we are importing more than what we are exporting. So don't be alarmed if you see a list of numbers and the net exports component is negative. That just means that we bought more stuff from other countries than they bought from us. Okay? And that's pretty common in the United States and for other countries too. Yes? But think about this. We're adding up all the dollars that are being spent in the economy. We have to acknowledge that some of the dollars that we spend our money on are for foreign goods, right? And this is our place to take those things out so they don't end up in our GDP. We want to add up everything that's spent. We got to have a place in our statistic that we say, well, that was $1 spent, but it was spent in Germany, not in the United States. So we got to have a place to take it out. Okay? All right. So these are our four components. So what we have to understand is that any change in any of these components will always change the GDP. And you will hear me talk about C plus I plus G plus NX a lot. Those four things, they make up our GDP. Okay? All right, we got one last thing that we're going to cover. This was going to be in yesterday's notes, but we're putting it in today's notes. Okay? And this is when we're talking about GDP, we often refer to GDP, or you're going to hear GDP referred to as either nominal or real. Okay? We have to know the difference. So let's just put nominal versus real GDP. Yeah, that's a new number. That's going to be number what? 4? 3? 4. Number 4. Nominal versus real GDP. So let's start with nominal. Okay? Nominal GDP. By definition is going to be GDP that is not adjusted for inflation. Say it's not adjusted for inflation. Now, students get confused by this, the wording of this, okay? Number one, inflation is something we're going to learn later on in this unit, but just for today, we just need to know that's when there's an increase in price over time, okay? If a statistic is not adjusted for inflation, that means when inflation happens, it will show up in our statistic. So when prices go up, if we're talking about nominal GDP, prices go up, inflation's going up, the nominal GDP is also going to go up because the nominal GDP is not adjusted for the inflation. So the inflation will cause the statistic to change. Okay? So we have a little formula for calculating nominal GDP. We'll put nominal GDP equals current production quantities, current production quantities. So it's the current amount that we produce, okay, times current prices. So we take the amount that we're producing, the price we're selling it for, we multiply those things, okay, and that's going to give us the number that would go to the nominal GDP. It's not adjusted for inflation. Now, we're going to add here, because there's an issue with this, and we're going to say that economists don't like using nominal statistics because when, we'll say, when GDP, actually it should be nominal GDP, so let's throw a little n in here. When nominal GDP increases, economists don't know if price increased or production increased. And that's a problem. So if I told you that the nominal GDP went from $17 trillion to $17.5 trillion over the course of a year, well, we don't know what caused that $500 billion increase. Did our prices go up or did our production go up? Okay? So we got to add here then what real GDP is, then we're done. Okay? So real GDP is GDP that is adjusted for inflation. GDP that is adjusted for inflation. And that means that when inflation happens, it does not show up in the statistic. So our real GDP equals our current production quantities, current production, times, what we call base prices. And that just means that an economist has picked a year, and they're going to keep the prices from that year constant. And we're going to measure the production from every year, but we're going to keep our prices the same. And that allows us to see if production changed, and it's adjusted for inflation, so there will be no change in prices that will show up in that statistic. Okay? We'll go over this more tomorrow a little bit. Now, just remember, your only assignment is take a look at reinforcement questions. I'm sorry, man, I keep saying that. Is multiple choice questions. Set 2. Okay?